I'm going to briefly touch upon a topic that even in the last, I would say, 2 years, has gone from being something that I would actually literally have to, I felt that I was swimming upstream and trying to explain, to suddenly almost a sea change where people seem to be able to see what is it, why is it that we are taking a systems approach. Some of this thinking is from the work that I'm doing with the World Economic Forum. I'm on their Global Futures Council for Systems and Platforms, and the World Economic Forum has done a big study on what are future forms of leadership, and in characterizing those, one of the ones that have come to the top is a systems approach. Now, before I launch into what systems approaches to leadership is, I'd like to for us to take a few steps back and think a little bit about some mega trends, and that might help kind of create a landscape for where that we are playing in. So first and foremost, I think that we can all acknowledge that our global economies have shown themselves to be quite fragile, and they're subject to a lot of perturbations due to causes that might not be immediately in your own economy, but might take place elsewhere in the world. And that is that, a further evidence that we are in a very much more networked global economy, and the regimes of scale are suddenly very different. And you can have a company like Uber or Airbnb that can come from nowhere and attain a global scale, and not only scale in itself, but create a lot of questions for other entities, as we just saw in the previous talk. Now, there are some much larger issues at play that used to be something that we could just say that, okay, it's someone else's problem, but it's beginning to affect business in its fundamental form, and that is a question around the uncertain future of our very, very fundamental resources such as water, food, energy, and so on, and the fact that we are in a very connected global economy with very sharp and growing inequities. I think you've heard some of that today, and how the distribution of wealth is changing, and that is creating pressures, and the pressures are already being felt in many ways, including the politics in countries such as ours. And this is leading to many different events of increasing levels of political instabilities and shifts in geopolitical and demographic patterns. And one of the demographic patterns that is really worth paying attention to is how in the developed world, and to some extent in emerging economies, there is a sharp rift happening between the level of income that the richest population have versus the average, and it's the middle class being under attack. But at the same time, countries like India and China having very, very large populations of people stepping into the middle class. So India has brought more people into the middle class in the last decade than the entire population of the US times 1.5. And that is, in a sense, a consumption bomb that our supply chains are not prepared for, and it is having some really interesting effects. And then we are in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution in technologies, and this is no joke. This is nonlinear technologies that have the potential of creating nonlinear positive benefits, but with a disproportionate possibility of creating nonlinear negative effects, unless they're corralled. And these are forces that we are just unleashing, and we don't really understand them. The consumption bomb and the middle class under threat is actually a double threat that has a way in which to throw the wrench into the works into the way our economies are structured, and more on that later. But mainly, no matter what type of player we are, even Stanford, which happens to be in the education sector, and the education sector, jokingly people say, changes fundamentally once every 200 years, typically 50 years after the world order has changed around. So we are not known for representing the most agile entity, and yet we move very fast. But if we normalize it to the rate of change that's taking place, we might actually not have increased our pace in changing, and the question of agility and the rate at which we change become very, very important issues. But there are larger issues at the level of sensibilities. Our organizations and what it constitutes to be educated itself is on the anvil and is changing. What people consider as fulfillment and their identities and the need for them to align with their organizational values is not something organizations have to deal with, particularly in shifting times, particularly in uncertain times where a whole lot of jobs might be at flux. So these things become important issues. But there is a big one, there's a big elephant in the room, which is that we have bedrock systems that our entire civilization stands on. And these are things we have not paid attention to because we take them for granted, and they're coming apart at an alarming pace and in ways that are making a direct impact on our realities right now. We already have climate events taking place, and they're just going to grow, and we already have climate refugees and climate-based water issues, and this is just going to conflagrate. And so and the fact that we are in the midst of a mass extinction is not to be taken lightly. And let's note the biggest one of them all. We are 7.46 billion people on a podunk little planet that was not meant to carry this population. It took us from the beginning of time to the early 1800s to reach the first billion, and we're going to add twice that in the next couple of decades. The planet, it's a matter of resilience. One can't grow our systems equitably at that kind of pace. And the reason I'm saying all of this is because we have some very, very large targets to meet if we are to meet what's called the 2030 goals, and these are not small targets. We need 40% more fresh water, we need 45% more energy, we need 40 to 50% more food, a massive reduction in CO2, even if you acquiesce to a 2-degree increase in climate, even if with its collateral damage. And we're in the midst of a mass extinction we haven't seen since the dinosaurs went extinct. And our confidence level, given our current methods, are very low. If you ask any sane person, what is the chances that we're going to get out of this with our current political will, with our current institutional structures? Unfortunately, the answer is not that great. And I don't mean to be an alarmist. This is just the world, this is the factual world, and we can look the other way, but the problem is that no matter what business we are in, that is not a luxury anymore. So the fact that the UN has come up with the 2030 goals and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is actually now a matter for every sector, not just for the government sector, for the private sector, for the education sector, for civil society, etc. And every time I see this, I feel that it is a little bit like my English teacher, who was a very kind and very fun person, and who gave you the feeling that you're her star pupil, very warm and friendly, and then she'd come and give you with your essay with a big smile, saying, "Here, darling," and you see a C-, right? This is the planet getting a D-, right? Even though there are these happy colors, it's the degree to which these issues are intertwined that is the insidious aspect of it. You cannot get more fresh water without expending more energy. You cannot get more energy unless you do heroic things without contributing to climate. You cannot grow more food without relying on water. You cannot attack poverty without also attacking consumption. These are very intricately intertwined issues, and it is the interconnectedness that makes up current approaches relatively inappropriate, right? and reduces our confidence. Now, these are scaled issues. We can't escape from the scale. We are all in a boat that's headed towards very turbulent waters, and the question is, to what extent are we going to ignore the issues of scale? And this is the symbol for the time constant. Time is not on our side. The rate at which we need to move very, very quickly, because we have a narrow window of time to essentially influence systems that our civilization rests on. And these systems are not linear. They're nonlinear. And what we know how to do well is, at the best of times, is that S-curve, which leaves a theoretical gap, right? So in a sense, what the position is that our next generation systems have to be nonlinear in order to chase nonlinear problems, right? And so what are the characteristics of these challenges? They're scaled, they're complex, more on complexity. They're extremely urgent, they're nonlinear, they're very, very integrated and interrelated. Some of them are critical, which means that unless we deal with it right now, some of them, a stitch in time could save 9, which means, and then some. So time, it's a little bit like this, the critical issue, right? If you are on a weekend, on a Saturday morning, cooking breakfast for your family, and you were cooking some eggs, you turned around to do some dishes, and then you turned back to your cooktop and found that your cooktop is on fire because the oil had spilled over, that is not the time to go off and reorganize your closet. You might want to put that fire out before it goes any further, right? A lot of our systems, our large systems, are at that state, right? And so they're critical and they need, but I think the thing that we also need to acknowledge are that there is a certain insidious issue, which is that our institutional structures are somewhat culpable in creating the problem. We are to some extent the enemy, and unless we consider reframing how we meet the future, we are essentially building that risk, right? Now, what we know for sure, is that change is inevitable, that uncertainty is inevitable. Growing uncertainty, and we are sailing into very turbulent waters, and it's a very, very different world order compared to the one that our organizations are designed for. It's a different world order. So it's a little bit like bringing tools that were made for one system and expecting them to work in another, right? So we could be improving our game but playing the wrong game, realizing that we were practicing a basketball throw and we've just arrived at a soccer field, right? And that could be as fundamental as the issue as that, right? So the thesis is that systemic challenges, if they are systemic, need to be met with systemic solutions, and scale challenges have to be met with scale solutions. Yeah, it's a pretty simple thesis, but it's a pretty defensible thesis, right? Now, here's a framework that I would like you to consider. This is by David Snowden, and he says that there are 4 types of problems. You have a simple problem where the answer is self-evident, such as how do you open a bottle of water if you've never seen that kind of bottle before. Typically, you'll figure it out with no manual. There are complicated systems, such as a watch or a car or a really complicated IT system or what have you, that requires a lot of specialized training. But the systems are very tightly coupled, and any one subcomponent has a very predictable behavior. So transmission of the car will always be a transmission of a car, and you can do what's called black boxing, which means that you can, even though it has many gears within it, you can just call it a transmission and expect what comes out of it if you give it a certain input. Not so with complex systems. Complex systems are a dance that are being played by a number of actors, where the state of any one of them is a function of the nature of the relationships with the other ones and their states. So think of a complex discussion in your extended family. That's a complex system. You don't know where it's going to go, right? And the behavior of any one entity is very much a function of the temperament and the mood of the other ones, right? Turns out that most of our thinking is in the complicated regime. We do very, very well when our problems are there, but we bring those tools even into problems that are in the complex regime with the hope that they'll work, right? And we are only realizing that a lot of the things that we really are trying to influence are actually in the complex regime, and we need new ways of thinking there. And so complex regime is like a forest with many, many relationships. Now, sometimes something happens to break the relationships, such as a forest fire, and it starts changing what a forest is very, very rapidly. The important thing to note there is that when you have a complex system going into chaotic, the amount of agency you have in actually arresting the change compared to the amount of the extrinsic forces that you have no control over plummets rapidly, which means that it might be like walking into a forest fire with a cup of water, right? It might not make as much of a difference. And you might have planned to go for a walk in that forest next week, but by next week, it might not be a forest anymore, right? So it turns out that a lot of our systems are tipping into chaos, and then we need to essentially do what we can to tame them, right? But here is who we are, right? We like simplistic answers. We like bottom lines that are quick, right? And in doing so, we light a fuse that might go off later. Now this, I don't exactly agree with this, because the word simple is something that is not necessarily tied to something that is, not complex. You actually want simple on the far side of complexity, not on this side of complexity. Because if it's on this side of complexity, you're using a theory of change that is not taking into account the complexity. So you actually have to have elegant ways in which to take on the complexity. Otherwise, your solution is simplistic. Now, a systems view is essentially understanding the underlying dynamics to whatever level of fidelity. You could do it in an hour or 3 hours, or take months over it, but it's a different way of looking at it. And once you look at it, then your theory of change needs to be in terms of how is the system working, and how is our intervention going to make a systemic change or not, rather than diving into a priori theories that are not tested in the system regime, right? So example, here is, you might not be able to read it, but it says terrorist attacks, threat to Americans, the theory is that we need to respond militarily, right? Alternate way of looking at it. Terrorist attacks, threat to Americans, need to respond militarily, US military activity, perceived as aggressiveness, terrorist recruitment leads to terrorist attacks, right? It's a feedback loop. Just a slightly different way in which to look at the problem, static view versus dynamic view, might completely change your position on what is the right thing to do. And this is a very simplistic view. It's a much, much more complex situation, but it's a different view. So not having a systems perspective in a systemic problem means that you're sailing without consideration to the winds, right? And you're looking at the world in black and white while it's in color. Though the system has no respect for our disciplinary boundaries, none whatsoever. The system is the system, right? And we bring to it our disciplinary boundaries and hope that it conforms to it. So what we need is a new type of leadership. Now, which is very different from this kind of leadership, right? Markedly different, because this is the leadership we know. When we hear the word leader, often, not necessarily in this crowd, but in organizational settings, we think of hierarchical systems that come from the military and from the nation state, and from further reinforced by centralized thinking that would happen in colonization. But what we look at when we do leadership is looking at leadership as a modality. Anyone can be a leader if you show leaderly qualities and ways of being. And there are many ways of being a leader. You can inspire, you can drive transformation, you can envision future states and drive towards them, you can frame intentionality in new ways, you can catalyze and enable, you can decide, create decision frames that are very different. I don't like the word disrupt, I just use the word enrupt, it sounds better. But there are many different modalities that it occupies, but ultimately it is acknowledging that our economy is changing. We had a purely consumption-based economy, and then we saw that the organizations that were able to create rich experiences, such as Apple, were able to gain a disproportionate value, not just because of their ability to drive efficiency, but to create rich experiences. And now there are indications that we are emerging into a transformation economy, and the organizations that are pertinent to the reality of the future are going to be left with a way in which to be pertinent, and the rest are going to get weeded out or be left disadvantaged. So what that means is that if the first one was leadership 1.0 and this was leadership 2.0, we have a different type of leadership that we need that assures the value of the other two, but then those are the table stakes to play the next game. And this form of leadership is the first type was marked by the ability to execute, right? Can you execute well? The second kind was, do you understand humans? Do you understand experiences? Can you create pull rather than push? Can you engage, etc.? Can you imagine new experiences, right? The number 3 is a different game, which is, can you change the system itself, right? Can you create next generation systems? So really quickly, some of the key responsibilities of a systems leader is actually to clone themselves and to create a certain type of innovation capacity. Now, what do I mean by innovation capacity? It means that in this two-dimensional frame where the level of expertise needs to be managed in the larger ecosystem, we work towards creating a portfolio where our collective ability to deal with scale and complexity increases. And the system leader's job is to manage this portfolio and make sure that people are climbing up that ladder and the different parts of the portfolio are managed, and not just be a leader unto themselves, but to create a distributed form of leadership. But it does take a few different deviations from current frames, and this is a much larger topic. I could speak for hours, but there are some key mindset issues that there needs to be a shift away from. First and foremost, we need to not be system blind. You need to think in systems. One needs to adopt a certain systems perspective because it shows you completely different theories of change, and it looks at the interaction between things, not in isolation. Frame blindness, which is a theory of change that knows how to question our own fundamental frames rather than just believing that, for example, GDP is a fantastic thing or growth is a fantastic thing, right? These are frames that if you do not question, one just hurtles down a side of a mountain and the boulder lies in a very different place than if you started the boulder going down a different face of the mountain, right? Methodology. Every type of work needs its own community of practice and its own methodology. It doesn't matter what it is. If you play soccer, you need to know how to play soccer. If you are a good chef, you need to know how to cook. Similarly, this is a new methodology, and there is a methodological aspect to this, and just common sense doesn't go far enough always. But what we talked about is such a new thing that if you go down to the fundamental description of what constitutes innovation, and the definition of innovation, my definition of innovation is whatever it takes to outperform the normative by a very large margin, right? There is the business as usual. What does it take to outperform that, but to create new paradigms, new outcomes, new system behaviors? And that is innovation. And we absolutely need innovation baked deeply in, and there are many implications of that. Scale is something that you cannot just say, can't be stuffed in after the fact. The DNA of scale needs to be baked in at every stage, starting from the early stages. Otherwise, you're relying on blind luck to have it scale. There are many dimensions to scale. And we do not have a century to solve our problems. We need to find ways in which to do time constant multiplication. We need to find ways in which to do exponential work. And this is not just to solve our problems. This is where the next generation of opportunities lie. All those problems and the SDGs are all markets in disguise, all needing education of a different order. And this is this is the game we need to play in, and recognize that it's not a solo sport, it's team sport, right? So I'm running out of time, so forgive me for speaking fast. But what this means is that we know how to do this. We know how to collaborate. A screen designer knows how to work with a UI person and with someone who does chipsets and a battery, and we come up with something like a cell phone. And we know how to do this pretty well, but this is not the same as co-creation. Co-creation is putting the challenge in the center and rising beyond your disciplinary boundaries and working in post-disciplinary ways in service to solving the problem. And the difference is that pure collaboration as we know it remains in the plane of the current possibilities, whereas co-creation creates completely new classes of possibilities. It creates new epistemologies. It creates new structures of possibilities that new next generation systems emerge from, right? So what we are on the quest for as systems leaders is simplicity, not on this side of complexity, but on the far side. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you.